I'm a believer that this team's going to win the national championship, the season of dreams.
So Juck over.
And if we allow them to devalue it, we lose a lot of what makes college football special. Don't let them do it. Don't let them devalue what it means to you. The Ohio State Buckeyes, the 2024 national champs, will be remembered for how they came out of that. And welcome to Juck on Bucks. Appreciate you so much for joining me on yesterday's show. Wasn't really a show. I did a 12-minute kind of recap on my thoughts about Ryan Day hiring Matt Patricia, elevating Tim Walton to the co-DC, which I think was the perfect move if you were going to bring in Patricia, as I think that Walton will be that head coach of the defense, the guy interacting with the players on that level, and he will work very closely with Patricia and kind of be that. That'll be his big dog role. Patricia will be the scheme guy. Long as those two are working together, I think from a football standpoint, this is going to be really successful. Ryan Day has been batting a very high clip with bringing in coaches, so I'm not going to doubt him. And I'm certainly not going to doubt him from a culture aspect. But I read all your comments. I know that many of you disagree very passionately, some of you, and I totally respect how you feel about it. At the end of the day, this is the decision that the head man made. It's his program. He's got to live with the results of it. And we'll see where it goes from there. Now, I did want more of a national perspective on that, so I brought a guest on with me, Joe DeLeone. Joe, Ruffino and Joe Show, a college football show that covers national football. He is also national college football, the national scene. He's also a Notre Dame fan. So we talk quite a bit about the national championship game, about Marcus Freeman, about what they got going on over there, about Ohio State stuff, about the rivalry. And we had a really good conversation. Notre Dame is a program that, with Marcus Freeman, with everything he's got going on, I came into the 2024 season thinking Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, and Oregon were the four programs most positioned from head coach, assistant coaching, recruiting classes, a recruiting machine, and support from boosters and whatnot for NIL that were going to be consistently competing for national championships for the foreseeable future. I now think that because Marcus is so special, what he's got going on at Notre Dame, that they are now entering into, in my mind at least, that now 5-pack of teams that I think are going to be right there competing for national championships year in and year out for the foreseeable future. So I picked Joe's brain a little bit about that, and we talked about all the rest of that stuff. So please do enjoy my episode here, my conversation with Joe DeLeone from Ruffino and Joe. Joining us now, we got the hardest working man in football podcasting, Joe DeLeone from the Ruffino and Joe Show. Joe, thanks so much for joining us here at Juck on Bucks.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. Appreciate you for coming on. Obviously, you're a Notre Dame guy. We're Buckeyes over here. Appreciate you coming on. I don't hate Notre Dame at all, considering all the rest of the Blue Bloods. I got a lot of Notre Dame fans in my family, and I really think that Notre Dame, we now as a college football community can admit, is fully back in a way that we thought maybe would never happen again. I was at the 2012 national championship game. This team that played Ohio State in the national championship game, light years difference, and I don't think that anybody can deny it, though I think we're hearing some people are. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the one aspect of this season that was really surprising to me was the amount of people that were trying to dunk on Notre Dame for not getting the job done and not winning a national title. In Marcus Freeman's third season as the head coach, it's easy to look at this and say, oh, they're still irrelevant. They've gotten to the national championship twice in the last 20 years, but they are not actually a national championship contender like they were last in the 80s. But for the way that they were able to rebound when so many people across the country, especially Notre Dame fans, thought the season was over after week 2 and they suffered one of the biggest upsets in the sport's history to NIU, the way that they were able to rally, I think, is an indication of how Marcus Freeman is pushing this team in the right direction. Even further than that, if we look at the national championship game, they played really messy in the first half, but Marcus Freeman rallied the troops. They weren't going to come back to the degree that they were actually going to tie the game up. I think that it's a little bit overly optimistic to frame it like that. But the fact that they got close enough and that they were getting the stops when they needed to, and they were generating the big plays through the air between Riley Leonard and Jaden Greathouse, the fact that all of that came to fruition in this game is that really strong, positive vision for how this team is going to get better year by year. The biggest part with this, and Ohio State fans are very familiar with how this sport works, you got to get to a national championship multiple times and lose, in my eyes, in order to establish consistency at the top of the sport. I know that there are coaches who have won it in their first trip, and some of those coaches have not even come back since that first trip to a national championship game. But Ryan Day, it took him multiple shots to the point where a lot of people were questioning if he would ever get it done, if he is, white knuckling the approach to big games like this, and if that was going to get in the way. But I think that in sports in general, having suffered losses in championship games and important games is important in order to take that next step. And for how early Marcus Freeman is into his coaching tenure, to suffer a loss that way and almost come back is going to only help them in the future. And it's helping with their marketability and recruiting as well.
That's for sure. Looking at Marcus, the way he was able to get them to rally, the way they played for him and for each other in that second half when it was over. I mean, I was live streaming the game and everybody was celebrating early in the third quarter. And, there came a moment there where it was a totally different tone. And I didn't see that coming one bit. I think it speaks volumes about him. And I've had a kind of strained relationship with Marcus. I think the couple instances that publicly of him maybe taking some perceived shots at Notre Dame, which I've never understood. We've all rooted for him forever at Cincinnati when he first took the job at Notre Dame. Never quite got that. But when we look at him as a head coach, what he's been able to do with them in just 3 years, he's awesome, man. The kids want to play for him. Parents want their kids to play for him. You listen to him talk, he's just like, wow, the dude's just got it. And coming into this year, we had Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, and Oregon as I think the 4 teams that we all thought were most equipped to be consistent national title contenders. I now put Notre Dame in this group.
And I think that they deserve to be there. And again, this is one of the biggest parts to me that was so surprising at the actually, it wasn't even at the end of the season. It was midway through the game when they were getting blown out before they started to put together their comeback. Everybody wanted to very quickly say, oh, Notre Dame's not legit to be considered there. But again, having this whole marketing run that they did during the playoff and the expanded playoff set this up perfectly for Notre Dame, that they almost weren't getting really talked about at the beginning of it. And then leading into, and as they were winning throughout it, beating Indiana, beating Georgia, beating Penn State, Marcus Freeman gets talked about more and more, how he's a trailblazer and how he's changing the sport. The biggest thing that you mentioned, if you talk to any recruit about how they feel about Marcus Freeman, they all say that they love him, that they see him as a father figure, that they're invested in him and wanting to play for him. And you also talk to any of the parents of those recruits, they feel that that is the right role model for their kids in order to take that next step. The right types of guys are buying into being a part of this Notre Dame program. And I think that is where they eventually take that next step, is, recruiting the premier 4-stars and the occasional 5-star to start getting in the conversations more consistently for some of these premier 5-star guys.
Yeah. I mean, he's totally authentic. There's no faking any of that. I think it's readily apparent. The Ohio State new athletic director, Ross Bjork, came out for some reason, decided to announce to the world that Ohio State was spending $20 million. That number, thought by a lot of people in the general college football public who aren't really in tune with this stuff, to be some astronomical figure, and that Ohio State was like in a world of its own. And, I would argue that money and keeping our college football players from going to the NFL benefits all of us as college football fans, making other teams more interesting because the players. I think that's one of the reasons that I kind of fell out of love with college basketball years ago, when you just couldn't identify guys from year to year. But we see these goofy graphics floating around now, and everybody wants to rank what these teams spend when nobody knows, unless, of course, your athletic director comes out and says it. I was caught by surprise how often I see Notre Dame at the top, because when we look at the way they operate in the transfer portal, similar to Ohio State, neither of them have grabbed more than 10 guys out of the portal as long as this has been around per year, which puts them, 90th out of 134 in terms of numbers of guys they're bringing in from the portal. How do you characterize Notre Dame's NIL philosophy, and where do you think they kind of fit in that hierarchy Are they up there in that top 5? Do you think is that the kind of funds they're generating for that?
Yeah, I think one other part of this Notre Dame program that's misunderstood by the general public is it's assumed that, one, they don't have the money to spend on top guys, and two, they're not able to attract some of the top players in the portal. I think that, one, Marcus Freeman's talked about this, how he wants to build through high school recruiting and then fill the occasional need through the transfer portal. That's the bigger key for success. But we need to remind ourselves that Notre Dame does have a very wealthy alumni base. They have a lot of business leaders that are Notre Dame fans and very passionate Notre Dame fans that give back to the program enough that they are in that top 10 of teams that are spending money. It's easy to assume that they're getting outbid for guys. I think just naturally what it sometimes comes down to is other programs having a little bit more leeway. There's also a lot more easiness on admissions at other schools because it's hard for Notre Dame to take undergraduate kids because of how hard it is to get players in admissions. But they are in that top conversation. They have the money. They have the resources. It's important for their transfer portal approach that they're not trying to just spend a crap ton of money and then hope it is a good enough of a roster to go out there and compete. They're not going to act like Colorado. They're not going to act like Florida State. They're going to try and get the right guys and develop them over time.
This conversation popping up when you look at Michigan now entering the space in a big way, and Notre Dame and Ohio State, that we're seeing a shift where maybe some of these Southern schools where they have the density of talent, now the Northern schools maybe have more money to work with. Maybe that's helping level the playing field here. Your co-host, an LSU guy. I imagine you guys have touched on this topic. What's your take on that?
We have touched on this a little bit, and I think that that's why we're starting to see this surge of Big Ten teams being successful. And if you listen to other shows and other pundits across the sport, they recognize this. And I think anyone who has a pulse on what's happening in college football is seeing that there is now an ability for these Big Ten programs to compete more closely with the SEC for top recruits. I think it's no longer about just guys wanting to stay close to home. I think that there's now an ability for, if all the top recruits, yes, they're coming still from the South for the most part, they're coming from Southern California. The regions haven't changed, but there's now an incentive that schools can put out there in recruiting financially to get them to leave and play away from home. And also the other part about this, a lot of these big programs that are having the most success in the Big Ten, Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, they're teams with very wealthy alumni bases. That is the big thing to point to. Some of these programs in the SEC that originally were consistent powerhouses that, they were paying for players, we'll call it what it is, they were at one point, they're not in that same level of alumni base of funding that they can get. It's a lot of grassroots funding. It's a lot of just fans that are excited about the team and want to donate whatever money that they can. Maybe it's doctors and lawyers are putting a few $1,000s or tens of thousands of dollars at a time. And you look at Michigan, who Larry Ellison's dropping a ton of money to go get Bryce Underwood. That is what you need ultimately, is to have that level of influence from people who, Ellison not being a Michigan alum, but connections to the programs that are willing to contribute.
Yeah, connections. We'll call it connections.
Right.
So I'm a big recruiting guy, and last week I was recapping the recruiting class after signing day for pretty much everybody in the top 15. Looked at Notre Dame, who held the number one position for a long time in this cycle. They end up finishing a respectable 12th in 2024, 9th, 2023, 12th. You look at Ohio State, Georgia, Oregon, Texas, Alabama, now Michigan bumping up in there in that top 6. And you look at these guys, where they're finishing, year after year up there in that top 5. It certainly makes it easy to compete for national championships with that kind of talent. And, 12th, finishing around that range, we know that you can win national championships with that. We've seen Michigan do it. We saw Clemson do it. But Notre Dame, respective to their recruiting rankings, I don't think it blows anybody away. But when I look at the guys that I'm seeing contribute early, when you look back at the class of 2023 with Christian Gray and Drake Bowen, Greathouse, Schuler, Jeremiah Love, Jagasaw. When we look at the class of 2024 with KBA and Bryce Young, Leonard Moore, and Anthony Knapp, like they are onto something here where I feel like they're doing a better job than everybody else, either identifying and evaluating or I don't know, man. What's the secret? I feel like they're younger guys that look better than a lot of these schools that are recruiting in the top 5.
Well, I think it paints the picture of how these recruiting outlets aren't always 100% accurate. Yes, they're within the ballpark of having accuracy on how certain recruits are going to produce and be successful, but there's plenty of times where these ultra highly rated 5-star quarterbacks don't work out. Malachi Nelson's the easiest guy that I can think of very recently, who has now on his 3rd school and has not even really contributed, couldn't even get on the field at Boise State at the G5 level. I'm not saying that to crap on the recruiting industry, but it's a signal that Notre Dame's great at finding unrecognized talent. They're great at scouting and developing. They were able to get so many contributions from freshmen. And to mention what I got back to at the very beginning, where I said that they have to find the right types of guys, there is a little bit of a academic restriction that they ultimately have to deal with Notre Dame being as as prestigious of a university as they are. That there's been a little bit more leeway over the past couple of years that Marcus Freeman has been able to get, but it's still hard to get some recruits in because of their grades. There does still need to be a bit of an academic focus. But you mentioned Michigan, and I kind of, after Michigan won the national championship, my first thought before Notre Dame even came as close as they did this year was, if Michigan can win a national title the way that they did, Notre Dame can as well. And Michigan was elite at finding 4-star guys, high 3 stars that would go on to be really important starters for them. And they would get those 5-star guys. They would get the Rashawn Garys every so often, the JJ McCarthys, who were highly recruited. Notre Dame doesn't need to, in my eyes, hit a class out of the park and have a million 5-stars. Like they're just not going to be able to beat an Ohio State or a Texas at that, because they're kings of recruiting. They're kings as brands, as resources, as what they're able to do. But the way that you overcompensate for that is through development and through scouting and finding the right guys that are unrecognized as being as good as they could be. And Notre Dame has found just tremendous success at that.
They really have, particularly their offensive line recruiting, which I was so amazed watching the 3 linemen leave in the portal who had all contributed this year. Talking to some Notre Dame friends, I'm like, yeah, what do you mean? Yeah, you just lost 3. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Look at and I'm looking, and they're right. That would devastate anybody else. So they're really killing it in that direction too. When we look at the coaching carousel last season, Ohio State, Notre Dame had the 2 best pairings of coordinators in college football, and I think there was a big gap after those 2. You guys lose Al Golding. Ohio State obviously loses both. You replace Golding with Chris Ash. What is your thoughts on that? If anybody hasn't been keeping attention, he was in the NFL just recently, not in college football. So how do you feel about them bringing him in to replace Al?
Yeah, I'm not particularly excited, and Ohio State fans have familiarity with him. He gets the Rutgers job when he did from Ohio State. He wasn't even a sole DC. He was splitting that role with Luke Fickell when he was there at the time. I'm from New Jersey. I live in New Jersey. I played college football at the FCS level, and I trained with a lot of Rutgers guys. And a lot of those guys that I talked to, they didn't have like super exciting things to say about him. They weren't talking as if they were blown away. And I'm not saying it's like a character issue with him and that he's a bad guy, but none of them were giving off this energy that, oh, wow, he was a great coach. He was a brilliant guy. If anything, it was kind of the opposite, that they were underwhelmed that this guy coming in from Ohio State wasn't able to be more creative in trying to find ways for them to win. Rutgers was awful when he was there and when he was the head coach. Is there a way that this could work out? Sure. He's been around some great coaching staffs, but I just look at his career trajectory since Rutgers, where it feels like it's been pretty downhill. And on top of this, the one time he was a play calling DC at Texas, albeit it was during that period of COVID, they were a mess. I believe they were giving up over 400 yards per game. They were not good defensively. So there's a way this works. I'm hoping that he is not the final say decision maker on defense, but I wouldn't be surprised if this doesn't end up going very well.
You lost Dylan McCullough as well, running back coach who we talked about last year when we were, searching for one before they brought in Carlos Loughlin. He heads to the Cowboys, and then Marcus goes and poaches off of Penn State's roster. And Juwan Cedar is a really good coach, very well respected, helped them co-offensive coordinator, I think, since like 2018. I loved that after seeing James Franklin take Jim Knowles, but really I liked it because of that press conference where James Franklin tried to kind of big brother Marcus before the Orange Bowl. Marcus looked pretty irritated. I think he got the last laugh. Thoughts on that move?
Yeah, it was a tremendous move by them to bounce back the way that they did. There were a lot of questions again with the Chris Ash hire from Notre Dame fans, but to go and get such a highly recognized and respected running back coach, I think arguably many people would say that he's at least top 3 among running back coaches in college football. Look at the amount of guys that have come through that program and the current production that they've had from Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. He's a great recruiter. He's a great developer. Knowing that Notre Dame's success this year came from Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love, there is a lot to, I think, be optimistic about. And he's not going to be calling plays for them, but there's a lot to be optimistic about knowing that there's physical trait similarities between Notre Dame's running back duo and Penn State's running back duo, that they could take this huge step forward to going from being a good rushing team to being a dominant and overwhelming rushing team.
The last 2 seasons, Notre Dame brings in Sam Hartman for a year, Riley Leonard for a year. 2025 looking a little bit different. CJ Carr in the system. Steve Angeli looked good when he came in. What do you think in the direction that's going to go between those two guys? You got any feel on that?
Yeah, I think that if anything, actually, it's a 3-man race here because Kenny Minchey should be brought into the conversation. He is very high ceiling player amongst this group. He's got the tools to be a productive passer. There's just 3 different directions on how they're going to approach this, I think. Steve Angeli is the high floor, consistent, steady guy that is going to keep the offense on schedule, but isn't going to take them over top. We saw that when he stepped in the Orange Bowl, what he was able to produce on those series that one series he stepped in where he started moving them down the field. They got into field goal range, but he almost gave the ball up on a strip sack. So there's some deficiencies. He's good enough. He's not going to really completely tank the offense. I think that there would be a hope that Notre Dame could go in a more exciting, explosive direction. CJ Carr, if you go with him, it's all right, we're starting the future now. We're getting him reps as early as possible. We're hoping that this thing starts to hit stride really by his sophomore season. He seems like he could be a tremendous leader and a great decision maker from all the things that you've heard about him as a high school recruit. That to me is, even if he doesn't start this year, down the line, if he's the eventual starter in 2 years, Notre Dame fans should be super juiced up about that because that's the type of guy that can help get a team over the top. And then the last, as I mentioned with Minchey, that's the high upside guy. If he takes the step necessary this offseason of improving and gets better than Steve Angeli, I think that the offense could be very aggressive downfield. I think that they can produce a lot more splash plays than what they did with Riley Leonard. Whoever they end up picking is going to come down to who's the hot hand at the time. I'll admit the one guy that I think is the most likely to not win, it's probably Steve Angeli, just because he's got a little bit more of physical limitations.
Let's get into some Ohio State stuff here. We've been talking about it pretty much exclusively for a couple weeks now. Ryan Day chooses to promote Brian Hartline, a guy who, I mean, as much as you can use this word in college football coaching, deserves it, right? He absolutely does. A lot of folks not too happy with this. They wanted a big splashy hire. I don't really feel there was one out there outside of maybe Will Stein out of Oregon, for my opinion. Pointing back to 2023 when it didn't work. And I think that really had just as much to do with Ryan Day not being totally ready to relinquish those duties as much as it had to do with Hartline, maybe not quite being ready. But Ryan Day goes and surrounds him with Tyler Bowen as the offensive line coach, who was the offensive coordinator at Virginia Tech, Billy Fessler, the quarterback coach, offensive coordinator at Akron, also called plays there. Keenan Bailey as his cohort now, co-offensive coordinator. I don't know how much he'll have to do with it, but it looks a lot different than having Chip Kelly at the helm. That's for sure. From the outside looking in, how do you view these moves here on offense?
Yeah, the Hartline move, I think, is the most interesting. And you mentioned all the surrounding hires around him should kind of calm any concerns from Ohio State fans for what you just mentioned there, that you've got guys that have held high level positions, that have had a lot of experience across the sport. Hartline, though, where the concern does come into play, you mentioned that 2023 season where it was underwhelming just overall offensively. How much did he really have in control there with decision making? We knew that Ryan Day had a lot to do with it. If Brian Hartline gets full control, I'd be curious to see how this turns out. There's just a level of uncertainty with that, not knowing what he's going to be like on a snap to snap basis as a decision maker. But again, I would still have a little bit of pause on if this is actually going to work or not. I just don't love this idea of what feels like going backwards. It already didn't really work well the first time. What about the situation is going to be truly different that it's going to produce better results? I do agree with you, though, the point that you brought up. I think one of the most, the biggest limiting factor, there weren't very many sexy options. There wasn't like a big name guy that you were going to go and steal away from another team. Will Stein was the best option, but Oregon's got enough money to keep a guy like that. So,
Sure.
yeah, it was just a tough year for them to try and find someone unless they try to grab someone from the NFL.
It was. And we had a lot of people with differing opinions on that one. But what we saw today with Matt Patricia being officially hired as the defensive coordinator, well, so we've heard via a leak, an official leak, but a lot of angry Ohio State fans about this since his name first came out. Obvious reasons. Hasn't been in college football since 2003. Relates poorly with players. What's he going to do in recruiting? You got the indictment in the 90s, how poorly it went at Detroit, how much players hated him. Like, list on and on and on you could go. So a whole lot of angry folks about this that feel like you settled on the offensive side of the ball rather than going out and getting better. And then you bring in a old NFL retread who just got passed over in the last 4 cycles by the NFL to kind of maybe, I don't know, allow him to rehab his career or something. Me personally, I got some strong opinions on it, but I want to hear what you think about it. Again, on the outside looking in. Matt
I
Patricia.
understand. Yeah, I understand that there's a lot of negatives with this that you just pointed out, but the positive side, and it's like the massive swing in the other direction. It's not like we're looking at all these negatives and there's a slight positive. The positive is that he was the defensive coordinator for 3 Super Bowl winning teams. He was around a winning culture, and he was, for that stretch, I think people forget how good that Patriots defense was. He is a brilliant defensive mind. The personality stuff is understandable to be worried about because you need to be able to relate to young men, not athletes that are in their late 20s and 30s. You're trying to relate to young men and trying to connect with them. You need to have a little bit of likability to you. But at the same time, college football's more modern or more professionalized. It's incredibly professionalized that there's a little bit more of this transactional relationship between coaches and players and universities. I see what Wink Martindale did this past year for Michigan and how even with inconsistent health from their top guys like Will Johnson and Mason Graham and Kenneth Craig, not having all those guys at once, for them to do what they did in a number of games where they were completely shut down and taking away and dominating opposing offenses, I think that should be the positive indicator to say, all right, and I know you don't want to look at your rival and think that like we need our own version of that, but to see that an NFL guy can come and step in and have that level of an impact, you should feel good about the Patricia hire. I think unlike offense, because there's such a difference between the NFL offenses and college offenses. It's why sometimes that translation doesn't always work when guys make the jump up or the jump down. But for me, defense is defense. If you are aggressive and you are downhill and you know how to play the chess match on a snap-by-snap basis, I think that stuff is going to end up relating to this level. This can work very, very well. The positive way to look at all of this is that the ceiling is very high. It just sucks that the floor is as low as it is.
I'm totally with you when we talk about the difference between the offensive coordinators between levels in the defense. I think these guys are looking at an offense and scheming to stop it is the same. And if you're in the NFL or in college football, and when it comes to relating to players and such, I thought Ryan Day did a really good thing. promoting Tim Walton to co-DC, and there's not a guy on that staff that relates more to the players than Tim Walton. So I think he kind of assumes that more leadership head coach of the defense kind of role that Jim Knowles had the whole thing by himself, and you leave Patricia to kind of scheme it up. I think it'll work well. As far as recruiting, Jim Knowles didn't do any recruiting either. So, it is what it is from that perspective. But when it comes to culturally, a lot of people worry this is going to be a culture killer. Ryan Day has done such a great job at building up that culture, and he risks it for no reason. Like risky players, he doesn't take them. I just trust so much. Like, obviously he knows this guy's past, that if he's going to sit in front of this guy and give it the go ahead, like if he's going to do it, I'm going to be okay with it because, he's the last guy that's going to let that go. Last thing, Joe, and I'll get you out of here. This obviously was a huge topic at the end of the year here, and it came up on your show on Sunday that I caught. And I didn't catch your answer to it because I was so mad listening to Blake, which you probably hear a lot, but I'm curious again from the outside looking in about the fact, and it is a fact, that a lot of Ohio State fans who live this rivalry every day care more about being the champion of that rivalry than the national champion. I talk to them daily. I don't share in that feeling because I would rather dunk on the rest of the country than just my neighbor, but I totally understand it because I've grown up in it and I get it. That's their top priority. And I just have a hard time when I hear people like Blake talk about that the other day and they just can't wrap their mind around it. He's not alone, but they can't wrap their mind around other people having different priorities and they can't accept it. And it's not just him, I'm just pointing him out, but I hear it from a lot of people. I don't get it, man. The rivalry was around 100 years before a national championship was ever played on the field. Why is that so difficult to grasp that some people care more about that? They live it every day. Yeah. You don't live a national championship every day. You live with those people every day. It's a fight every day. And I totally get it. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, we were bringing this up when we were talking about Ryan Day's extension. And my take and what I had brought up with this is that it's really odd to me that Ryan Day, he's accomplished so much. He's established himself as the second best coach in the sport now that he's won a national title, and he's going to likely win more, that he's gotten over the hump now. It's him and Kirby in this upper category with Dabo in the mix there as well. It's very odd, though, that he can't find success against Michigan. And then what I was trying to illustrate on the show was that it is a very unique situation. It's not Alabama, LSU. It's not Notre Dame, USC. It's not Auburn, Alabama. It's Oklahoma, Texas. To what you just talked about, that is a day in and day out talking point, like crap talking point that you can have with the opposing rival, that you won the national title, but Michigan fans will gladly rub it in that they beat you guys this season. I saw it all over Twitter. I see it all over Twitter that it keeps getting brought up. Michigan fans are more than happy with the fact that they won the national title 2 years ago, that they played like shit this year as long as they beat you guys, and that they
don't even care. They don't even care about their record.
Right. They don't care that you guys won the national title. It's very interesting. And I think that it's a dynamic that's hard to wrap their head around just for outsiders. The reason why I think that maybe I have a better understanding of this is like being from the Northeast and knowing what the Midwest is like. It's just a very different approach than down South, where that ultimate goal is, if I lose to my rival, but we win a national championship, I'm fine with it. It's interesting. I think that there should be some psychological study put into it, but I stand on your side of this, where yes, the national championship's the bigger thing, but it's not surprising that some fans still would be frustrated by Ryan Day not being able to beat Michigan.
Do you think the new postseason has diminished the rivalry in any way from your perspective?
I don't think so. I think that the only way that it does is that you no longer have to beat Michigan to get to a national championship. It was something that we've seen happen in the past with the 4-team playoff. And the first time where both Michigan and Ohio State got in a couple of years ago was that kind of first time where, Ohio State lost, but they still had the opportunity to go play in the college football playoff. But it used to kind of be a barrier for determining if you were good enough to go to the Big Ten championship game and then eventually to go on and compete for a title. I think what's maybe a bigger detraction is the fact that you no longer are impacted if you go to the Big Ten championship game, that now there's no hurdle where it's just the top two teams. we could have a back-to-back matchup between the two of them, which is going to be crazy, and it's definitely going to come to fruition.
Yeah.
But I don't think it diminishes it, though, because the intensity still is there, and you could see it was very palpable after the game and after Ohio State lost that the intensity is 1,000% still there.
I wasn't a proponent of expanding this playoff to 12 teams. One of the big reasons was because I thought the rivalry may take a hit. And now that we were able to see, the ultimate horrible scenario, which to me, that was my horrible scenario, was one of these teams loses the game and then wins the national championship. We see it year one. And happily to report, it's actually added a new element. Like it's just a totally different element that I never saw coming. It's even more fun, but I think it's so important to preserve it. I think it's so important for both schools and states. It's added a ton. It adds in recruiting. It adds just from eyeballs nationally and attention to both schools. And it's something I love. Joe, I love your show, man. I appreciate you so much for coming on. Tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, you can catch me on Twitter at Joe DeLeone. And then you can catch Ruffino and Joe Show on YouTube. We're live every single Sunday, Monday, and Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. It was great getting to hop on. I'm sure I'm going to be on again in the future, and I appreciate the chance that we got to connect. Should be an interesting offseason. We'll see what Ohio State can do.
Thanks so much, buddy. Talk soon. And that's my guy. Always a fair guy. A piece of news on the way out. Sam Williams-Dixon, I know some of you guys really liked him. He entered the transfer portal. He is not going to be leaving the team. He is asked to come back. The program has allowed him to come back, so he will compete in spring practice and maybe enter the spring portal after that if he can't get anywhere, but they're going to allow him to come back to the team. Good on them for allowing him to do that. Not every school does. You enter the portal and they say, no, you're not coming back. And a lot of guys do enter the portal. They don't get the attention that they thought maybe they would. And they end up, coming back and saying, please take me back. And a lot of schools say no, piss off, but they didn't. They took him back. So good on them for that. He's a really nice guy, not a culture killer. Most guys aren't at Ohio State. So they allow him to come back, and good on them for that. I think that's really cool. I don't think that he's ever somebody that's going to be really carrying the ball in any capacity for Ohio State. I think I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you guys. You're the best. Please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon. Juck and Bucks out.